Hezekiah of the land of Judah. I surrounded and conquered 46 of his fortified walled cities and little towns in their countryside, which were without number, by having ramps trodden down and battering rams brought up, the assault of foot soldiers, sapping, breaching, and siege engines. I brought out of them 200,150 people, young, old, male and female, horses, mules, donkeys, camels, oxen, and sheep and goats, which were without number, and I counted them as booty. As for Hezekiah, I confined him inside of the city of Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. I set up blockades against him and made him dread exiting his city gate. As for Hezekiah, fear of my lordly brilliance overwhelmed him. Hello everyone, this is Gilgamesh. This is part of my ongoing series on Isaiah, but in this episode I don't feel like we're ready to dive into the text just yet. Before we move on to the historical chapters in Isaiah, I want to take a side trip and talk about the archaeology, and particularly how our view of all these events was greatly enriched starting in the late 19th century. The people involved in this saga are colorful and interesting, and one of the shortcomings I feel is present in many of the discussions on this subject is a tendency to recite conclusions and facts without ever explaining the story of how we came to know that information. I find it very important to place in context what we have learned and when we have learned it. Brilliant people have been writing commentary on the stories of the Bible for thousands of years, but it's important to understand how views before the modern era lacked information we now have at our disposal. In short, previous views of the Bible often viewed the Israelite culture in maximalistic terms. The thought was any culture that could have produced such a rich collection of documents must have also been the dominant culture of their time. Text within the Bible itself certainly reinforced this viewpoint, describing a glorious past and future for the nation. Two principal cultures surrounded the Israelites, the Egyptian and the Mesopotamian cultures. They left us with fascinating ruins that stirred our imaginations, and we knew something of them from biblical and classical Greek and Roman histories, but we had no ability to read their language of either of these two great cultures. This all changed in the second half of the 19th century, and when it did, we started to realize that Israel was the small underdog culture that was dominated throughout its entire history by these two superpowers. In this video, we're going to look at the Mesopotamian culture and how we opened up its records and found the Hebrew Bible inside. Before I go further, I'd like to take a moment and thank our channel members. These generous individuals contribute a few dollars each month to help keep this channel going. As you can imagine, information about the Hebrew Bible that does not lean into sensational or speculative theories, proselyting, or take a position attacking the text and its authors doesn't work well with the drama-driven YouTube algorithm. No matter how exciting I make the thumbnails, I will never be as popular as some of the more bombastic creators, and I'm okay with that. I never expected to reach the level of popularity that I have. This is mostly just a fun side project and a creative outlet for me, giving voice to a perspective that seems rare, appreciating the Hebrew Bible from a perspective of scholarship, trying to understand what the original authors intended with their writing and the world that they lived in. As an intelligent listener, you may choose to synthesize this information with your own faith tradition or not. But whatever your perspective, I hope you come away understanding a bit more and have a few ideas to ponder after each video. If this is appealing to you, please like and subscribe and consider a membership if you want to help the channel continue. I have no team helping with any aspect of this channel. It's just me, and my day job isn't even related to this subject. Thanks. For centuries, King Sennacherib's invasion against the Kingdom of Judah in 701 BCE and the subsequent siege of Jerusalem relied almost exclusively upon the Hebrew Bible, specifically the narratives preserved in 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and the book of Isaiah, alongside the fragmented and often heavily Hellenized accounts of Herodotus and Josephus. The emergence of vast cuneiform archives from the buried capitals of Mesopotamia would change all of this. The royal annals of Sennacherib, inscribed on a series of multi-sided clay prisms, were one of the greatest finds. They were commissioned by the Assyrian King Sennacherib to immortalize the military conquests and architectural triumphs. These documents were originally intended as foundation deposits, buried within the substructures of monumental palaces and arsenals at Nineveh as a sort of time capsule to communicate the king's glory to the gods and future rulers. The successive rediscovery and decipherment involves 4 primary intact copies of these annals: the Taylor Prism, the Rassam Cylinder, the Chicago Prism, and the Jerusalem Prism. Nineveh was situated on the eastern bank of the Tigris River, directly opposite the modern city of Mosul in northern Iraq. It was transformed into the glittering capital of Neo-Assyrian Empire by Sennacherib following his ascension to the throne in 705 BCE. Sennacherib embarked upon a massive program of urban renewal, the scale of which was unprecedented even within the formidable building traditions of Mesopotamia. The archaeological footprint of ancient Nineveh is dominated by 2 massive artificial mounds, or tells, known locally as Kuyunjik and Nebi Yunus. Kuyunjik, the larger of the 2 mounds, served as the administrative and royal heart of the empire. It was here that Sennacherib constructed his legendary Palace Without Rival, also known as the Southwest Palace. This labyrinthine structure featured walls lined with intricately carved alabaster and gypsum bas-reliefs detailing the king's military campaigns, most notably the Lachish reliefs, which provide a harrowing, room-spanning visual narrative of the Assyrian siege and the subjugation of the second most important city in Judah. To the south of the Kuyunjik lies the smaller mound of Nebi Yunus. This site has long been revered in local Islamic and Christian traditions as the burial place of the biblical prophet Jonah, a religious significance that historically restricted the scope of any invasive archaeological excavation. During the Neo-Assyrian period, the Nebi Yunus Mound housed the royal arsenal, frequently referred to in the Assyrian texts as the rear palace or the armory. It was heavily utilized for the storage of military equipment, tribute, and the mustering of the Assyrian war machine. The formal archaeological exploration of Nineveh began in 1842 under the direction of French consul Paul-Émile Botta, marking the birth of Mesopotamian field archaeology. Botta's initial efforts were soon eclipsed by the British explorer Austen Henry Layard, who conducted extensive and highly publicized excavations at Kuyunjik between 1846 and 1851. Layard's systematic clearance of the Southwest Palace revealed the spectacular Lachish reliefs and initiated the transfer of thousands of cuneiform tablets to the British Museum, laying the physical groundwork for the discipline of Assyriology. However, the initial discovery of the annalistic text documenting the 701 BCE campaign actually predated Layard's formal large-scale excavations. It arose instead from the localized, unmethodical artifact hunting and antiquities trading that characterized European diplomatic involvement in the Ottoman Empire during the early 19th century. The earliest of the complete annalistic texts to be recovered is known as the Taylor Prism. It is a hexagonal, baked red clay document standing 38 centimeters high, that's about 15 inches, with a maximum width of 14 to 16.5 centimeters, about 6 inches, containing 6 columns and roughly 500 lines of densely packed Akkadian cuneiform script. The text records the first 8 military campaigns of Sennacherib, culminating in his wars against Elam and Babylon, and features a detailed account of the 3rd campaign against the Levantine coalition and the Kingdom of Judah. The Taylor Prism was discovered in 1830 during an informal exploration digging at the Nebi Yunus Mound. The artifact was acquired soon after discovery by Colonel Robert Taylor, after whom it is named. The biography of Colonel Robert Taylor exemplifies the fusion of imperial administration, military service, and scholarly antiquarianism that defined the early Orientalist movement. Born on April 25, 1788 in Mumbai, or Bombay, India, to a British military family, Taylor's early life straddled the colonial and European worlds. He was initially educated in Paris before attending a preparatory school in Ascot, England, where he developed a profound affinity for classical literature and ancient history. Returning to the East in 1803, about 15 years old, as an army cadet for the Honorable East India Company, Taylor embarked on a career that would demand intensive linguistic and diplomatic immersion. Taylor demonstrated an extraordinary linguistic aptitude, eventually mastering Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and a variety of other Asian dialects. His career was not without some dramatic interludes. He famously eloped with a 12-year-old Armenian girl named Rosa, being himself about 16 or 17 years old at the time. While Rosa's age is concerning to our modern cultures, it is important to remember that this was a very different culture and time, and while I know very little about their story, it is reasonable to conclude that a peaceful continuation of childhood for Rosa was not a likely option. Rosa, along with their son, later garnered local fame by surviving capture and ransom by pirates while traveling to join her husband, and she subsequently undertook a grueling overland journey from England to Baghdad. Rosa and Robert remained together for the rest of his life. The story was new to me, and I must admit I want to learn more about this interesting couple. By the 1820s, Taylor had ascended the diplomatic ranks, serving first as the resident in Basra and subsequently in 1828 to 1843 as the British resident and consul general for the East India Company in Baghdad. Operating from Baghdad, the administrative center of the Ottoman Mesopotamia, Taylor wielded significant political influence and utilized his position to cultivate a fastidious and unparalleled private collection of Oriental manuscripts, focusing heavily on Arabic and Persian texts relating to science, geography, and history. It was during this tenure in Baghdad that Taylor acquired the hexagonal prism from Nebi Yunus in 1830. At the time of its acquisition, Cuneiform was an entirely undeciphered script. Taylor unknowingly possessed an artifact of immense historical value that neither he nor anyone else on Earth could read. The prism remained in Taylor's private collection in the Ottoman Iraq area until 1846, when he returned to Europe. Following his death in Bologna, France, in August 1852, his widow, Rosa, facilitated the sale of his extensive collections. The Taylor Prism was formally purchased from Mrs. Taylor by the British Museum in 1855, with the transaction brokered by Taylor's diplomatic successor and the pioneer of cuneiform decipherment, Sir Henry Creswick Rawlinson. The text of the Taylor Prism features an internal dating mechanism, an eponym date. The eponym dating system was a calendar system for Assyria in use for over 1,000 years. Every year was associated with the name, an eponym, of the Limu, an official who led that year's New Year festival. The Taylor Prism records the Limu as Bel Emurani. This allows modern chronologists to securely date the creation of the Taylor Prism to 691 BCE, roughly a decade after the 701 BCE campaign against Jerusalem. Because it was composed later in Sennacherib's reign, the Taylor Prism represents a later, highly refined edition of the Annals, wherein the scribes abbreviated certain details of earlier campaigns, such as the exhaustive list of Judean booty, to accommodate the inclusion of subsequent military endeavors. The monumental task of breaking the Cuneiform code was largely accomplished through the genius and physical bravery of its new custodian, Sir Henry Creswick Rawlinson. Working in parallel with the brilliant Irish clergyman Edward Hincks, these two, along with the younger Jules Oppert, would become known as the Holy Trinity of Cuneiform. But let's talk about Rawlinson first. Born on April 5, 1810 in Oxfordshire, England, Henry Rawlinson followed a trajectory similar to Robert Taylor's, entering the military service of the East India Company at 17 in 1827. As an officer, Rawlinson was deployed to India and later to Persia, where he was tasked with training the Shah's army. It was during his time in western Iran between 1836 and 1838 that Rawlinson became captivated by the Behistun inscription, a colossal relief carved into a sheer cliff face by the Achaemenid king Darius the Great. Displaying remarkable physical courage, Rawlinson scaled the cliff to transcribe the trilingual text, which was written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, a later dialect of Akkadian. Because Old Persian script was phonetic and slightly better understood by European scholars, Rawlinson used it as his Rosetta Stone to painstakingly decipher the vastly more complex syllabic and logographic Babylonian cuneiform system. Rawlinson's diplomatic career advanced concurrently with his linguistic triumphs. He served as a political agent in Kandahar, succeeding Taylor as the British resident in Baghdad, sat as a member of parliament, and served on the Council of India. Despite his heavy political obligations, his motivation to unlock the ancient past remained unyielding. As early as 1835, recognizing the potential value of the artifact, the 25-year-old Rawlinson had visited Colonel Taylor and created a paper squeeze, a mold, of the Taylor Prism, securing a copy of the text long before the physical object ever reached London. By 1851, the combined efforts of Rawlinson and Hincks had cracked the foundational grammar and vocabulary of Akkadian cuneiform, while Jules Oppert, close on their heels, identified the even older language of Sumerian. On August 23, 1851, Rawlinson published an explosive report in the prestigious English literary and scientific magazine, the Athenaeum. In this report, and in subsequent outlines presented at the Royal Asiatic Society, Rawlinson announced that he had successfully read the names of Hezekiah the Judahite and the city of Jerusalem within the cuneiform texts inscribed upon the stone bulls of Nineveh and upon the hexagonal clay prism acquired by Colonel Taylor. The public and scholarly reception of this publication was instantaneous and seismic. Mid-19th century Victorian society was undergoing a profound intellectual and spiritual crisis, spurred by the rise of Enlightenment rationalism, Darwinian evolutionary theory, and the emergence of historical critical methods that question the literal historicity of the biblical text. Before 1850, historians possessed virtually no contemporary extra-biblical evidence to corroborate the historical narratives of the Hebrew Bible. The sudden appearance of an authentic, contemporary Assyrian document detailing the celebrated war against Hezekiah was viewed by many as a miraculous validation of biblical history. The text confirmed the geopolitical realities of 2 Kings 18 through 19 and Isaiah 36 to 37, listing the tribute exacted and the devastation of the Judean countryside. However, it also sparked fierce and enduring scholarly debates. The Assyrian annals made no mention of the miraculous destruction of Sennacherib's army by an angel, claiming instead that Hezekiah was overwhelmingly defeated and locked up kima itsor kupi arishu, like a bird in a cage. This tension between verification and contradiction revolutionized the fields of biblical exegesis and Near Eastern historiography, forcing scholars to develop new methodologies for analyzing propagandistic ancient texts. While Henry Rawlinson and Edward Hanks established the theoretical framework for decipherment, the monumental task of systematically translating, organizing, and publishing the rapidly expanding corpus of Assyrian literature was largely shouldered by George Smith. George Smith's background stood in stark contrast to the aristocratic, university-educated, and military backgrounds of men like Taylor and Rawlinson. Born on March 26, 1840, to a working-class family in Chelsea, Middlesex, Smith received very little formal education. At the age of 14, he was apprenticed to the London publishing firm of Bradbury and Evans to learn the trade of banknote engraving. Despite his demanding trade, Smith possessed an insatiable autodidactic brilliance. Captivated by the sensational reports of Layard and Rawlinson's discovery, the young Smith spent his lunch breaks at the nearby British Museum, staring at the newly exhibited cuneiform tablets and teaching himself to read the script using limited publications available, as one does. His extraordinary natural talent for identifying cuneiform signs and reconstructing fragmented tablets caught the attention of Samuel Birch, the director of the Department of Antiquities, who subsequently introduced the young engraver to Sir Henry Rawlinson. Recognizing Smith's genius, the museum formally hired him to assist in categorizing and translating the massive influx of Mesopotamian texts. George Smith achieved global fame in 1872 when he translated a fragment from the library of Ashurbanipal that contained an account of a great deluge, the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. According to contemporary accounts, upon realizing that he was reading a Mesopotamian flood narrative that predated the biblical book of Genesis, Smith became so overwhelmed with excitement that he jumped up, rushed about the room, and began to undress himself in front of his astonished colleagues. Beyond his sensational discovery of the flood tablet, Smith dedicated himself to consolidating the historical records of the Neo-Assyrian kings. But then he died. In 1878, 2 years after his tragic death from dysentery in Aleppo during an archaeological expedition, his seminal work, History of Sennacherib, was published posthumously. This book represented a massive leap forward in the discipline. Rather than providing mere summaries or selective translations, Smith provided complete transliterations of the Akkadian text alongside English translations, establishing a formal text-critical foundation that allowed other scholars to engage directly with the linguistics of Sennacherib's third campaign. If you are planning on learning Akkadian yourself, I strongly recommend this approach, as identifying the cuneiform signs in the clay is its own special talent, and it is much easier to read when somebody has already done that work for you and you can simply examine a nice printed copy. As the study of the Assyrian text matured in the late 19th century, scholars recognized that the Taylor Prism, dated to 691 BCE, represented a heavily edited, later version of Sennacherib's reign. To reconstruct the most accurate historical picture of the 701 BCE invasion of Judah, historians required the earliest possible edition of the Annals, composed before the scribes were forced to abbreviate the text to make room for the subsequent wars. This vital missing link was provided by the discovery of the Rassam Cylinder. The artifact is named in honor of the uncle and nephew archaeological duo of Hormuzd and Nimrud Rassam. Nimrud Rassam is one of the most fascinating and underappreciated figures in early archaeology. Born in Mosul to a prominent Chaldean Christian family of Assyrian descent, Rassam's intimate knowledge of local languages, customs, and topography made him an invaluable asset. He began his career in the late 1840s as an assistant to Austin Henry Layard, seamlessly blending Layard's broad exploratory vision with acute on-the-ground operational skills. Rassam studied briefly at Magdalen College, Oxford, before returning to Mesopotamia, where he independently directed major excavations for the British Museum, discovering the Cyrus Cylinder, the Balawat Gates, and the magnificent library of Ashurbanipal, which included the Epic of Gilgamesh. Rassam also led a dramatic diplomatic life. He was dispatched as a British envoy to negotiate with King Theodore of Abyssinia in 1864, resulting in a harrowing 2-year imprisonment before his rescue by a British military expedition in 1868. Despite his unparalleled contributions to archaeology, Rassam often faced prejudice and was sidelined by the British establishment, engaging in a bitter, years-long libel dispute with E.A. Wallace Budge of the British Museum, who falsely accused Rassam's team of smuggling antiquities. Between 1878 and 1882, the British Museum authorized Rassam to resume excavations at Nineveh. Because of his expanding responsibilities across multiple sites, Hormuzd appointed his nephew, Nimrud Rassam, to oversee the daily operations at Nineveh. Nimrud Rassam concurrently served as the British consular agent in Mosul, navigating the complex local bureaucracy to facilitate the excavations. Sometime between December 1878 and late 1879, while digging deep into the foundational structures of Sennacherib's palace without rival on the Kuyunjik Mound, Nimrud Rassam unearthed 4 exceptionally well-preserved barrel cylinders. 3 of these artifacts were immediately dispatched to the British Museum, where they received registry numbers, while the 4th was retained by the Ottoman authorities and sent to Istanbul. The Rassam cylinder is especially significant because it dates to the eponymy of Matunu, firmly placing its composition in the year 700 BCE. This means the text was written scarcely 6 months to a year after the conclusion of the 701 BCE campaign against Hezekiah. As the Editio Princeps, the first edition of the campaign, the Rassam Cylinder preserves the most exhaustive, unredacted account of the invasion. It contains a expanded, highly detailed inventory of the tribute and booty extracted from Jerusalem, including specific numbers of livestock, concubines, and musicians, details that were subsequently truncated by the Assyrian scribes when copying the text into later editions like the Taylor Prism. In the early 20th century, the center of gravity for Near Eastern scholarship began to expand beyond English, German, and French, suddenly finding institutional support by those uncouth Americans, particularly at the University of Chicago. This shift was marked by the acquisition of the Chicago Prism and the subsequent publication of the definitive English translation of the Annals by Daniel David Luckenbill. The acquisition of the Chicago Prism was orchestrated by James Henry Breasted, a towering figure in American archaeology. Born in Illinois, Breasted earned his PhD from the University of Berlin in 1894 under the tutelage of Adolf Ehrman, becoming the first American to obtain a doctorate in Egyptology. Appointed as the first chair of Egyptology and Oriental history in the United States at the University of Chicago, Breasted possessed a grandiose vision for the interdisciplinary study of the ancient Near East, popularly coining the term the Fertile Crescent. In 1919, armed with a substantial financial backing from the philanthropist John D. Rockefeller Jr., Breasted founded the Oriental Institute and embarked on a massive reconnaissance expedition through the Middle East. The geopolitical landscape had been shattered by the end of World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, creating a chaotic but fertile environment for antiquities procurement. Traveling via the newly inaugurated Mesopotamian railways and armed caravans through dangerous territory, Breasted reached Baghdad. In late 1919, with formal accession recorded in 1920, Breasted purchased a pristine hexagonal clay prism from a local antiquities dealer in Baghdad. This artifact, now known as the Chicago Prism or the Oriental Institute Prism, stands 38.5 centimeters high. The internal eponym dating the Chicago Prism places its creation in the year 689 BCE, the eponymy of Gahilu, roughly 2 years prior to the Taylor Prism. Because of its superb state of preservation, preserving nearly all of its columns in excellent condition, the Chicago Prism quickly supplanted the Taylor Prism as the standard, most reliable copy of Sennacherib's later annals. The formidable task of integrating the Chicago Prism into the broader scholarly corpus fell to Daniel David Lukenbill. Born in Pennsylvania, Lukenbill studied Semitic languages at the University of Pennsylvania before pursuing advanced studies at the University of Berlin and completing his PhD at the University of Chicago under Robert Francis Harper and Breasted. As professor of Semitic languages and literatures at Chicago, Lukenbill was a central pillar of the American Assyriological establishment. He was appointed as the inaugural editor of the colossal Chicago Assyrian Dictionary Project in 1921, managing a team of scholars compiling lexical data from thousands of cuneiform inscriptions. In 1924, Lukenbill authored the Annals of Sennacherib, published by the University of Chicago Press. This monumental work represented a quantum leap in methodological rigor. Lukenbill used the newly acquired Chicago Prism as his base text, but provided an exhaustive critical apparatus that cross-referenced every line against the Taylor Prism, the Rassam Cylinder, the Bellino Cylinder, and dozens of smaller fragments. By producing autographed cuneiform text alongside highly accurate English translations, Lukenbill created the definitive edition that would dominate the academic community for the next 70 years. The corpus of intact hexagonal prisms was augmented once more in the late 20th century. In 1970, the Israel Museum in Jerusalem acquired another complete exemplar at a Sotheby's auction in London. The artifact, which came to be known as the Jerusalem Prism, was procured from the estate of a prominent Armenian-American antiquities collector, Hagop Kevorkian, heavily funded by the philanthropic gifts of Miriam Schacher and Joy Ungerleider. Standing 31 centimeters high, the Jerusalem Prism dates to the exact same year as the Taylor Prism, 691 BCE, the eponymy of Bel Emirani. The text of the Jerusalem Prism remained largely unstudied for 2 decades until it was formally published in 1990 by the Assyriologist Panina Ling Israel. The publication of the Jerusalem Prism provided crucial insights into Neo-Assyrian scribal practices. Ling Israel's analysis revealed that the text of the Jerusalem Prism is virtually identical to that of the Taylor and Chicago Prisms, containing only minor orthographic variants. This uniformity demonstrates the highly standardized nature of Mesopotamian scribal training. Texts such as the Annals were traditioned, constructed using heavily memorized modular blocks of texts that were copied verbatim across different cities and different years by highly trained bureaucratic scribes. The latter half of the 20th century, scholars recognized that Lukenbill's pioneering 1924 edition required updating to reflect new linguistic discoveries and fragments. The Dutch Assyriologist Rakele Borger, renowned for his mathematical precision and exhaustive cataloging of cuneiform signs, in his 1979 work, Babylonische Assyrische Legerstücke, Borger corrected minor syntactical errors and, utilizing the Chicago and Taylor prisms, constructed a highly reliable Akkadian teaching text. German scholar Eckhard Fromm built on Borger's work. In 1997, Fromm published the definitive modern critical edition of the text, Ein Leitung in die Sanherib-Inschriften. Fromm systematically collated every known fragment, prism, and bull inscription, allowing him to track the exact evolution of Sennacherib's royal propaganda. Fromm demonstrated precisely how Assyrian scribes manipulated the text over time, abbreviating the Judah campaign in later editions to emphasize the destruction of Babylon, or altering the list of conquered towns to project an unbroken narrative of divine favor and absolute royal omnipotence. By mapping these editorial changes, Fromm allowed historians to read the annals not as objective history, but as carefully constructed ideological literature. Finally, we have Chaim Tadmor. Born Chaim Frumstein in Harbin, Manchuria, to a fur trading family, Tadmor immigrated to Mandatory Palestine with his mother in 1835 following his father's death. While serving in the Haganah and tutoring mathematics to survive, he enrolled at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, studying under Benjamin Mazar. He subsequently received fellowships to study at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London under Sidney Smith, and at the Oriental Institute in Chicago under the legendary Sumerologist Bino Landsberger. Returning to Israel, Tadmor became the founding father of Assyriology at the Hebrew University and the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities. Tadmor's lifetime of research culminated in his collaboration with Mordechai Kogan on the definitive Anchor Bible commentary for 2 Kings, and directly addressed the historical contradictions surrounding the 701 BCE campaign. Tadmor also dismantled the two-campaign theory. Throughout the mid-20th century, prominent scholars such as W.F. Albright and John Bright championed this theory to harmonize the biblical and Assyrian texts. The theory posited that the biblical text actually conflates two separate invasions: a successful Assyrian campaign in 701 BCE, recorded in the Annals and 2 Kings 18:13 through 16, and a second undocumented campaign late in Sennacherib's reign, about 688 to 681 BCE, that ended in divine disaster, recorded in 2 Kings 18:17 through 1937. The chronological linchpin for this theory was 2 Kings 19:9, which states that Sennacherib was distracted by the approach of Taharqa, king of Cush. Remember him? Or maybe it was him. Egyptian records say that Taharqa did not ascend to the throne as pharaoh until approximately 690 BCE, so proponents argued that the battle must have occurred during a second campaign in the 680s. Tadmor, utilizing updated chronology by Egyptologists like K.A. Kitchen, argued that the title King of Cush was applied retroactively by a later biblical editor, much like we might say that President Reagan starred in the movie Santa Fe Trail, even though at the time he wasn't president. Of course, by early estimates, in 701 BCE, Taharqa was approximately 9 years old, and that seems problematic. However, with the updated information from Kitchen, it is estimated that he was actually about 20 and could plausibly serve as a military commander under his brother, Pharaoh Shabitku, leading to the Egyptian-Nubian coalition forces at the Battle of El Teika. The total absence of any Assyrian or Babylonian records indicating a second Western campaign by Sennacherib in the 680s, combined with the lack of a second archaeological destruction layer at cities like Lachish, has led the majority of modern historians to reject the two-campaign theory, making the single-campaign model of 701 BCE as the academic consensus. Okay, Last one for real this time. I need to mention the recent work of Stephen Compton. He is a PhD candidate at the University of South Africa and was recently published in the University of Chicago's Journal of Near Eastern Studies in October 2025. He also has an article on his work in the Armstrong Institute's magazine. His research is substantially new, but he asserts that one of the reliefs found in Sennacherib's palace is actually a depiction of Jerusalem and possibly even of Hezekiah himself. I find his work persuasive, but it is still far from established at this point. So, I hope you have enjoyed this look at the archaeology and the people who made it possible. Scaling cliffs, traveling through war-torn and hostile lands, facing disease and pirates, making amazing academic breakthroughs, all helping us to see the past a little more clearly. I do not want to give the impression that all the questions are answered or that there is some consensus on how everything played out, but this is possibly the spot where archaeology and the Bible meet most strongly, and much of what we know has been uncovered only in the last century and a half. Did you think archaeology was this exciting? Let me know in the comments. If you want more of this kind of content, like and subscribe and click the bell. YouTube no longer shows videos to people just because they subscribe. At any rate, peace and love to you. Shalom.